they kind of go rogue. They kind of have a mind of their own and start doing stuff on their own. For example, you give a goal to your agent. I want to make sure that people don't churn on my SaaS application. So what the agent started doing is just calling their customers nonstop just to renew. If you really want to have churn, that's what you would want to do, is call your clients nonstop to renew, because they get so mad at you for doing that and bugging them.
All right, everybody, how's it going? My name is Titus. I am the VP of Go-to-Market and Developer Relations at Civic. At Civic, we're focused on enabling secure agentic AI with authentication, orchestration, and automation at the core. On this show, we unpack what's happening in the world of AI, from agent ecosystems, tooling, security that keeps things running. Before we begin, as always, please like, subscribe, follow us on your favorite platform. Your support always makes a difference. Today, we're joined by Tom Taulli. He's a prolific AI builder, expert, author, and educator who's written the playbook on building Gen AI agents across every major platform. We're excited to have him on the podcast today. And Tom, please introduce yourself to the audience. Looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Yeah, and great to be here. Hopefully everyone's doing pretty good out there. Yeah, in terms of my background, started as a developer when I was probably like a lot of developers when I was in high school, and got a computer and learned how to program on my own. And I have a bit of an entrepreneurial background in terms of starting different companies back more in the 1990s and the dot-com era. And but I've also done a lot of writing, written books and articles and so forth. And so that's been kind of something that's been really helpful to me. And like you said, I've done, created courses and things of that, things like that. In terms of AI, I really got involved in this probably about 2018, is because I wrote a book that came out in 2019 called AI Basics. And I just thought AI looked interesting. The book still sells today. It actually sells more today than it did back then. So it's kind of funny. Doesn't even have anything to do with, doesn't mention ChatGPT. It was right before, it was before ChatGPT. But there's just so much interest in it. So it's been a really, it's been definitely a very crazy journey over the years.
Yeah, it's definitely a frothy space right now. I can imagine like the volumes, like people searching for these topics has increased exponentially. Everybody's trying to upskill, everybody's trying to learn kind of the basics and get themselves up and running as soon as possible. And I feel like GPT or like Claude or the transformer models that we have today, I think they're a great application, but I think the principles still are largely the same when like we all started our AI journeys back in, like, for me, it was 2016. 15, 16, when deep learning was starting to like get traction again. And then, yeah, after like GPT-3 came out, everything blew up. Yeah. So, I mean, I think in terms of how you evolved in the space, sounds like you started, I said you started in 2018. Did you kind of follow that AI thread? How did you end up in the agentic space?
Yeah, I think if you start off as in AI at that time, you probably have no choice but to get pulled into agentic AI. So yeah, I just think it's a natural evolution just because of how things are moving, how fast, like you said, how fast things are moving. The big event was, OpenAI and the transformer models wants to push things. So everyone wants something different and more innovative. So that's kind of where the action is today. And it's fairly recent, a couple of years. So, I think it's more of just natural evolution than anything else in terms of where that did. But in terms of, you mentioned, I wrote a book on agentic or AI agent type frameworks like AutoGen and LangGraph and so forth. That idea for that book came out I think it was the summer of 2024. And you were already starting to see AI agents, this whole concept of AI agents start to emerge. And I thought, this looks really interesting. So that's where I started the book. And you started seeing these, you had LangChain and, some of these frameworks already, and they're kind of moving in that direction. So that's the other part of kind of this evolution too.
Yeah, in a way, if you look back and squint a bit, even RPA looks agentic to an extent.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I know, exactly. So I wrote a book after the introduction, to the AI Basics book. after that, I wrote a book about RPA, and RPA was really starting to get a lot of momentum. And, when you think about it, it's AI agents are kind of a AI plus RPA construct. And so it's kind of weird that, I mean, I had no idea that that would happen, but it became a really good foundation for understanding AI agents, having that RPA background. People nowadays kind of dismiss RPA. Oh, they think it's a huge mistake. But, but I think it is a really good foundation for where we're at today. And I think if you do want to get into this space, I do think you should know some things about RPA.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we can talk about that a bit later when we talk about like devs and how they need to think about agentic AI. But before we go there, since like you've kind of hit on all of these emerging trends early on with some of your books, like what's the latest that you're looking at that you haven't written about yet? Can you give us some preview?
Well, I would say that the Agentic AI book was, well, it was like a million years ago now. It was like a year and a half ago. But, that was really focused on the frameworks. But, now we have, now is, and also I'm currently an advisor to Salesforce for their Agent Force platform. So kind of been really immersed during the last 7 or 8 months into kind of the enterprise use of AI agents. And I think that's something that's kind of the next thing. And I think, you talk about security, there's observability, there's orchestration, there's just so many things to make these things production ready that I don't think we're kind of there yet, but I think it's going to take time. But I just think that's kind of the next thing that's interesting to me is, I think we've gone through kind of more experimental phase, but at some point, they need to be ready for prime time if this is ever going to just be justified as an investment.
That makes total sense. And that kind of gives us a great segue into the kind of state of AI today. So for somebody who's building with LLMs, hasn't gone fully agentic yet, what's kind of the simplest way to understand what an AI agent actually is? How do you like see that?
Mm. Yeah, I did a presentation late last year to a group of entrepreneurs, and a lot of people showed up, but not because of me. I think it was because of the topic, and everyone was talking about the topic. So what I did is I went through, I went to Amazon, I went to Microsoft, I went to SAP, I went to all these big companies, and they all have white papers and articles and blogs about what are AI agents. So I would take their definition of what an AI agent is, and I found out that there's no universal definition of an AI agent. Themes, but to just have a really definitive explanation of what this technology is, I don't think we have that. And I also think the other problem is that now every company seems to think they're an agentic AI company, whether they are, whatever it means, or if they even know what it means, that just clouds it even more. But if I were to say, what is an AI agent? I would just say there's probably some elements that you would usually associate with an agent. One is some level of autonomy where it kind of makes it the reasons, it plans, it makes a decision. And usually that's driven by an LLM, which we all know. Usually there's some type of tool or tools being used along that. So maybe there's collaboration between the human and the agent, some type of, maybe the agent doesn't know everything. So there's maybe some human in the loop, or maybe the agent helps the human. That agents tend to be a little bit more goal oriented, so you kind of give them objectives and it kind of figures things out. The agent figures things out on its own. Hopefully it does it right. And then there's some type of interaction with the environment some way. A lot of times that's just someone types something in or APIs or data comes in or whatever. So those are the kind of elements. But if you just look at regular ChatGPT, even if you don't use the agentic mode, a lot of times you're using it as an agent because the element, and then it uses tools. It a lot of times search the internet to help answer a question. Well, that's using a tool. It will, maybe I wanted to do a calculation. Well, a lot of times it'll create a Python program to solve the problem. Well, that's a tool. It's calling it a tool. So if you just use kind of ChatGPT on just a very casual way, a lot of times it's an agentic experience right there. Pretty basic agentic experience, but I think that's giving an idea of what it is. But at the end of the day, the marketing people have kind of made it difficult to figure out like what this really is. But I would just look at it as that in terms of certain themes or certain elements you typically associate with AI agents.
I agree. I mean, if you go back to kind of the early RAG days, even then you could say you're spinning up sort of an agentic workflow to process some data in a way that required an intelligent step. But now it's productized to the point where we have it on our phones, on apps, within also like the chat apps like Telegram or WhatsApp or wherever you're connected to your OpenClaw nowadays. So the world has evolved quite a lot. I mean, I remember when ChatGPT didn't have access to the internet, it was kind of like self-contained, and that was not really agentic.
Yeah. No, I agree. Everything's kind of moving in that direction anyway. So, and it's going to get to the point where, we'll have something else new and shiny, but I guess this is the new and shiny thing for now.
So speaking of new and shinies and adoption, I think one of the things that stands out every time I go in and scrutinize where are we today in kind of the adoption curve with AI agents. It's like about only 11% of use cases made it to production last year. And you've compared this kind of agentic AI moment to platforms like that, mainframes, PCs, cloud, mobile. Where do you see like where we are on the adoption curve? How should people think about it?
Well, I mean, if you look at usage of Gemini or these types of applications, there's quite a bit of adoption. Those are mostly individuals, probably not the most sophisticated things, but these kind of filter into businesses, and the enterprise does raise some concerns. But, I do think the chatbot applications, I mean, that's kind of the first stage that we're seeing. But yeah, there's lots of figures out there, and they get outdated pretty quickly. I think Gartner says that this year, I think last year was like 5% of enterprise applications will have some agentic capability. I think they're predicting that to go to 40% this year. So I think we're in this rapid adoption cycle, which makes it a lot different from some of the prior eras, because while those became ubiquitous, it usually took longer for that to occur. And then you have another stat from Gartner, I think for 2027, where they say that 40% of all agentic projects will fail, and those are like companies trying to do it on their own instead of doing stuff off the shelf, which is probably not off base. So there's a lot of statistics out there, but I do think it's clear that, there's a lot of momentum with it. And, and you just have to look at the capital expenditure of the hyperscalers. They're driving it. I mean, I can't imagine. It's just hard to think of all of them. I mean, we're running out of memory. I mean, if you had bought Micron and Seagate and these, you'd be rich right now. You didn't have to buy NVIDIA. You just had to buy the commodity memory companies, because the hyperscalers have this insatiable demand for all this, these kind of the core components for data centers that they're building like crazy around the world. And, I do remember, I mean, I was back in the dot-com days, remember? And I do remember there was that CapEx explosion. So I don't know where it goes, but at least as we stand today, there's a lot of momentum.
100%. I mean, I'm thinking just from an OpenClaw perspective, right? If you look at the numbers of how many people are deploying those, like in the cloud, like it's maybe in the 40, 50 thousands of them, if not more, unreported. So if you need 8 gigabytes of RAM for every single OpenClaw deployment, I mean, you can do the math on how many terabytes and petabytes of data center RAM you need to run all of these. And these are like simple agents.
Yeah.
They're running on like an NPM. If you're doing more complex use cases, if you're actually even like, if you need to deploy your own models, for example, that requires significantly more memory. You need the GPUs also from that perspective. So you have like the CPU stuff is not really that top of mind, but you have like the RAM and then the GPU power plus the GPU RAM being the biggest bottlenecks, I think, right now. Plus the electricity itself to run the whole thing, right? Because that's also a big talk right now in the market.
Yeah.
But you touched upon something very interesting earlier on the security and then deploying that to production. You did also a section of your book on security and ethical consideration. Like, what should developers be worried about when it comes to shipping agents? What are kind of the risks from your perspective?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the open claw. I mean, with natural language can you're giving access to this platform to your system, and maybe, and for maybe a lot of people that doesn't, it's not a big deal, but if you're a business, it could be a big deal. So I read some report the other day where, an agent kind of went, these rogue agents, they kind of go rogue, they kind of have a mind of their own and start doing stuff on their own. And like one started just, you kind of get like, for example, you give a goal to your agent to say, I want to make sure that people don't churn on my SaaS application. And I guess this is a real life example. So what the agent started doing is just starting calling their customers nonstop just to renew. All right. If you really want to have churn, that's what you would want to do is call your clients nonstop to renew because they get so mad at you for doing that and bugging them. So there's also something like common sense and things that humans are actually pretty good at. But sometimes computers and agents and AI takes things just a little too seriously, or they don't know necessarily the context of what they're working with. And that's not necessarily security per se, but what it does go to is like the dangers of allowing these powerful systems to have full access to your local machines, and then to be able to access APIs whenever they want or however they feel that they should. And APIs are not the most secure things in the world either. Who's to say how secure, when someone uploads a skill on OpenClaw, I mean, how do we know how secure those skills are? I mean, are they taking all your data? Are they doing something malicious? So I would just say that, it's the shiny new thing and all that. Yeah, it's really exciting, really fun until it's not exciting and fun. And, it's just deleted all your email or done something with your email that you really didn't want it to do to your email, but you gave it access to do that, and it's like, for a lot in the old days, you would never do something like that. But now you have these agents and you think they're intelligent. Well, okay, yeah, I'll just press yes and grant permission and, you know, oh yeah, sure, I'll do that. And you start doing all that stuff and something goes wrong. And also the other thing is once, these things go wrong, sometimes, it happens so fast and you know, and all does it all over the place that it's, after you stopped it, the damage has already been done. It's like, and it's not, so I think, part of the security issue is not even necessarily malicious. It's just things that go out of control or rogue. But I do think that these agents can be hijacked and, done at incredible speed to do some damage as well, and so I just think it's a wild, wild west at this point, which means for security purposes, especially if you're an enterprise, you got to be very careful.
And I see some trends emerging now with a lot of the IAM companies, the SSO providers trying to step in and fill that gap. I think there's also like a generation of companies like Civic, where we saw this gap in the market in terms of like you have agents, but how do you connect securely and gain more control over connections? You add guardrails, you add observability, auditability, revocation. To your point, like if it starts doing bad things, can you stop it fast enough? And then the other hand is like, can you scope it to do things more narrowly, as opposed to like how people install OpenClaw on their machines, like full access. For me, that was a big barrier of entry when OpenClaw first came out. I was like, I'm not going to install this on my machine. So I had to sandbox it in a VM and like spend hours configuring it and figure out how it works. Whereas now I just like, I can spin it up in the cloud and give it a connection through a proxy like Civic. And then I can have read-only access to my email, read-only access to my calendar, or write only to create new meetings, but do not delete my other ones to make room for this other random person that's pestering you to schedule a meeting with me.
Right.
Because then that's what people tend to do now. They exploit the weaknesses in AI. And I feel like, to your point around prompt injection or like being attacked from the outside, I think there's also like a lot of naivete that when it comes to these reasoning engines, like they're fairly inexperienced humans to do a parallel with that when they haven't seen like what bad people can do unless they've been trained to do that. And then we're actually working on a feature called Bodyguard to make sure like there's another entity supervising what's happening with the prompts so that you don't end up in a bad situation from that perspective. But still a lot of gotchas in this process where devs just set an agent wild, or like somebody who's not a dev also sets an agent in the wild right now, and then stuff happens and you're like, well, why did that happen? We don't really know, or at least not yet. And there was no way to stop it really quickly, so we just destroyed our database or whatever happened there. Which is, I mean, for a small company that's just doing some experiments, may not be as life threatening, but I feel like a few $1 million and up business that's making, like, producing value, delivering value to customers, an outage like that, I mean, that's life threatening for the company.
Yeah.
So I think that's still one of the biggest gaps in terms of like these frameworks, because they all delegate security almost to somebody else in the way they word it. And I get it. Path for adoption is like least amount of friction with the user. But then in practice, to your point, like there's a lot of unknown unknowns in the enterprise, especially when there's value at risk.
No, totally agree. And yeah, I think a few weeks ago, Amazon, because I think Amazon encouraged a lot of vibe coding on their AWS for the systems they were building. And it became so difficult to manage and secure. And they had increases in outages that they just started pulling back on that and saying, we need a lot more oversight on these vibe coding systems and so forth. So, that's probably a bit of the canary in the coal mine, because, these are innovative organizations that, push, but, they have customers and they need to make sure, things work the way they should, and they have SLAs and contracts, and, you don't want to mess with that stuff. It gets you in big trouble very quickly, and your reputation goes down the drain too. Um, so yeah, I think, you got to just be tread, very carefully in this, and probably just assume the worst is, and all those principles of security still apply, like you said, grant them the least amount of, permissions that you can, that they can get their job done. And, don't, just take all those type of, those kinds of concepts and apply them because they still work,
100%, 100%. And I think like that's more of the downstream consequence of an AI agent doing a task that then breaks an existing working system or an existing like non-agentic system, or impacts the customer directly. But then I think the other piece that's still non-trivial for a lot of people out there is like, how do you think about building production use cases to begin with? Like from a like RAG agent perspective, but generally AI agent perspective, what's the hardest part about building one of those agentic deployments that works reliably?
Well, I just back up a little bit and so you go back to, I want to go back to RPA, because I think this is where we get in trouble about this, because you get this feeling like there's this agentic miracle drug, cures cancer, does everything you can imagine. And it doesn't. It doesn't. It's, agentic AI is for certain use cases. And yet companies have spent billions and billions of dollars on RPA, for example. And there's certain processes that don't change a lot, that are very clear cut of what the process is, A, B, C, D, and you get this at the end, and you want that to happen all the time. Are you going to go there and put some agentic AI system in there when it's working fine? You've already invested, it's already in your workflows. Why? Why would you want to do that? So I think the first thing to do about any of this, building applications, just like with anything, it's not the technology. It's like, is this technology the appropriate way to solve this problem? And if so, okay, then we look at all these different things about how we do it, how we deploy it, how we secure it, observability, all those kinds of things. But, if you're in the healthcare industry or financial services where accuracy is like regulated, I mean, it's not like a nice to have, it's like you have to have, or else you get fined, you get you get put in the penalty box, and your customers are going to go away. you know there are those businesses, and then but let's say it's marketing. All right, well, I mean, how important, in a way, sometimes being inaccurate is a value, about marketing, right? It's more about creativity. things like that. And or making errors aren't is problematic, but there's some, and their workflows are not necessarily, set in stone either. A little bit more amorphous. So in that kind of context, these AI agents may make a lot more sense. But we're seeing also like with lane graph and so forth is like trying to combine both of these. You kind of have certain elements that are deterministic. These are how they go. And then these are a little bit more non-deterministic where, there are more judgment calls involved about the decision making, but still probably, put the guardrails around that. So that's how I kind of look at this. But I think the problem today is that, and this comes from the CEO, usually the CEO or the board, or because they read all the stuff and they feel like this is going to cure cancer and solve everything. And so they put these mandates down saying we got to be agentic, we got to do blah blah blah, and realize, oh, it's just going to lead them down to outcomes that are going to be suboptimal. And that's where the Gartner 2020, 2027, 40% failure for agentic systems makes a lot of sense to me. Because I think we're kind of going down that path at this point.
Yeah, it almost feels like companies should approach this from a previously it was a digital transformation path, like going from non-digital to fully digital business, and now they're going from digital to agentic AI, and there's an RPA stop there. There's like an AI agent component to it, but like it's not fully agentic to begin with. And we're going to have also the AI agent native companies being started now that look completely different, like what the employee-less company, like with just the founders, or a company who raises just like a fraction of amount of money that to build up an MVP versus what they need to like to do it 5 years ago or 3 years ago even.
Right. Well, I would look at more because I've been kind of more involved with enterprises or large businesses. The other issue too is that, you got these, all these agents proliferating. Well, someone has to manage that. And there's this whole thing about human agent interaction. It's kind of a new area. And that's not an easy thing to do. And then, these companies buy other companies and they may have different types of agents and different types of systems and approaches and cultures and the way they do things. It just becomes a big mess at some point. It's just the pure management of these systems. You're doing this to try to increase productivity, lower costs, make things easier. But then we have the real world where we have acquisitions, we have different people, we have different cultures, change management, all those kinds of things that just really, and that's where I think that RPA book to me is like the one I'm most proud of, because I think that book actually tells you a lot of, that book was not about how to build RPA. It was about how to think about technology and improving your organization, but realizing, your people, it's all about change management, and your people, need to have clear-cut guidelines on how to move forward and what to do. And I don't think we're anywhere near that at this point. So it's gonna be kind of a little dangerous for some companies, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I feel like these are the principal level issues, right? I think people are still not quite there, even understanding those. And then if we go down into the weeds, it's like, well, how do you make it work reliably? How do you like maintain state across long running workflows? Like these all prevention of compounding errors, like kind of getting baked into your recursive systems or your autonomous systems. Those are more for like, I feel like the early adopters and the innovators out there. Do you see any movement in the enterprise side on that end, like trying to solve those problems internally, or is it like still more or less we're in the how to adopt this phase?
Well, I know Salesforce, that's security is pretty much job number one. You're dealing with sensitive, confidential information. You're dealing with the very critical workflows for companies. So before they deploy something, it's rigorously tested, and it may not look like the most advanced or innovative technology, but I think there's a reason for that because you don't want to be you don't want to be too cutting edge with people's data and information, and it takes years to build the trust with the customers and to get them to believe in you're doing the right thing. And so, and they're your customers, want to make sure that they're being treated in a way that where they understand the importance of your data, and it shouldn't, and the outcomes that You want to get real clear-cut ROI and things like that. So I think I think their company's doing it the right way, but it's kind of tough for them because it's hard to be at the bleeding edge and do things in that manner. You kind of have to take your choice. If you want to be at the bleeding edge, well, things are going to break and things are going to inevitably go wrong. And for maybe the startup customers, that's fine for them. But the banks and the healthcare organizations and stuff, you just can't. You can't do that. So I think it's a matter of the context of what you're talking about. I do think, but I do think if I think we're gonna. I think in security as an example, because these are new systems. So sometimes companies may not even know they have a problem until it's a little too late, and they just they kind of fester for a while. And a lot of this is new, so I have a feeling next year or two we're going to see some interesting cases, and that may make it where some of these customers become a little more hesitant in going down this path.
So speaking of
But
these
right now, it doesn't
bigger,
seem to be the case. But we'll see.
yeah, speaking of these bigger players, like, do you see them more or less building custom stuff in house, or are they using any open source frameworks? Is it a mix of things? What are you seeing kind of evolve?
From my standpoint, it's a mix of things. So they'll work with some of the proprietary players and for certain things. And because I think this is the other thing too. You don't want a frontier model for everything. It's a bit of overkill. It's kind of expensive. That's why I think these small language models are very popular right now. And there's you can make they're a lot lighter. Also, you can put them on devices on the edge, and they don't take up as much resources, and you can fine tune them for very specific purposes to solve certain problems. So I do think I think that you're seeing more of like a hybrid approach of, it just depends on what makes sense in terms of what you want to get. But yeah, if you're trying to, use a frontier massive model for everything, you're probably not doing it the right way.
Yeah, it makes
But that
total
does
sense.
take expertise. That's the other thing too. And do these small companies really have that data science expertise? Salesforce, they can hire, these PhDs, Meta and all these big companies can do that. But if you're a small company, I mean, do you really do you have the ability and the money to work with these SLMs and fine tune them? So I think ultimately, you probably have, the smaller companies probably have, at some point, you're probably going to have to buy this off the shelf, or else you're going to probably waste a lot of money.
And I think one thing that's not really obvious to me right now is like what's missing from the ecosystem to get there. Like, what tools do you think we still need to build? What's already in place? I think that's something that I'm thinking about actively right now.
Well, it's probably everything needs to be built. If you look at building an application, like let's just say I want to build a SaaS application, not an AI. Just if I want to build a SaaS application, I got Next.js that builds out. I just spin up Next.js. I go to Vercel and host it there. And then I can use Stripe for the payments and whatever. I need to store documents. Maybe I'll use Cloudflare for that. So you got these things you can kind of stitch together in these ecosystems that have evolved, and these different things where in a very short period of time and a very affordable, very easy, and reliable components you can put together and create your application. I don't think you can really do that with agentic AI right now. So, so I do think what we're going to see in the next few years is a move in that direction where you'll have the Stripe of this or the Vercel of that, or, the Next.js of this. And, the stack will start to be clearer and also more reliable and durable. I think there's a lot of progress with these frameworks, like Graph and so forth, but it's still pretty complicated to use, and you need to make good experience to be able to use these, I would say. So yeah, but I do think we're good. To me, that'd be great if we had something like that where you can kind of piece things together, and you have these pretty clear-cut components that you need a recipe for developing something like that.
That makes sense. I mean, that's definitely a barrier for adoption, especially for like people who are not super experienced developers or not
Yeah,
developers at all. It's
yeah,
quite involved now to get an agent up and running because it does involve some amount of coding, whether you like it or not, in most
yeah,
cases.
yeah, yeah. It's yeah, like I said, a lot of developers don't know that. I mean, they're good at Next.js and working with Stripe and all these they can build you a really good web app, but then when it comes to building agentic into that, a lot of them really don't know how. You got the wrappers. I guess you can, connect the API. That's pretty easy. But there's a little bit more, if you really want a little bit more sophisticated agentic AI application, you have to go a little further than something like that.
That makes sense. I think we touched upon some of the future looking stuff as well. I think one thing I want to ask you is like, what is the biggest misconception that people have about AI agents right now?
Misconceptions would be maybe that they can well, one, it's like some magic that'll solve all your problems. And you'll be on a beach somewhere and it'll do everything for you, and in the background, and everything will be just great. And it's like an army of assistants and employees, of virtual employees that are just helping you out, and you don't even need to hire anybody anymore, things like that. So that'd be kind of the misconception. Now, there's some people that I think can pull that off, but I don't think a lot of people are. I think there's a lot of people on Twitter who make things up, but
Yes.
but if that I'm not sure how much of it is real. So I kind of discount it a little bit. I do think there's a lot of gaps. What the capabilities are. And again, going back to what I was talking about, the RPA, there's certain things that the old school approaches work just fine, more affordable, more reliable, cheaper, you know, they just do it. So why would you want agentic for these, certain things when the old way can work just fine?
Yep, that's awesome. So before we wrap, I do want to ask you some rapid fire questions. We'll go for 3 questions. Please answer like as short as possible. Yeah, then we're gonna do one final segment and then we're gonna wrap.
Okay.
So, from your perspective, overrated or underrated? Fully autonomous agents with no human in the loop.
Overrated.
Then fill in the blank for me. In 3 years, every developer will.
Be unemployed. No, just half of those. It was funny. A year ago, I would say in 3 years, every developer would not be writing code anymore. Maybe that's this year. I don't know.
It's very possible. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's right.
yeah, a lot of people are vibe coding, including at Amazon or other like big companies.
Yeah, I think, or a lot less of code than you were before. But, it kind of goes to that other thing too. Like, how many people were writing code anyway when you had Stack Overflow and Google?
Yeah, to be fair, to be fair, there's a lot of guides being pasted as is and adapted to your environment variables, and that's it when it comes to code. And then one last question from Rapid Fire: one tool you use every day that isn't an AI product.
Notepad.
Staff take notes. Yes, 100%. That's a very
I use it
underrated
every
activity.
day, every day. I do a lot of writing. Notepad is great because it does one thing pretty much the way you want it to do it. There's no, oh, this is the other thing I really hate too. Like Gemini now just pops up and just says, "Do you want to use this? Do you want to use that?" Like whenever I go to Google now, it's like, "Do you want to do this AI?" I go, "No, I just want to do what this application was meant to do." And look, I know there's going to be a nightmare day when I go to Notepad, and it's going to be all this AI stuff popping up in my Notepad. And I was like, "No, no, no! I just want to take notes, my notes. I don't want you to do anything with my notes, but to save it and put it in a certain area. As long as you can do that, you're the best app for that."
Yeah, I have the same feeling sometimes when I'm coding in Cursor. I'm like, it starts like auto completing, and it's like
Hey,
that's not what I want.
that's
I want
right.
just to like guide this thing or correct this thing that
Yeah,
the Claude did for me in this
yeah.
file. And it's like I don't want another AI thing intervening over the previous AI thing and making it worse. Totally get that. All right. So I think that's a wrap for us. I think the last thing I typically ask people when they come in is like, where can people find you, pick up your books, follow your work?
Yeah, I mean, I would say LinkedIn is probably the best. Just put my name in there. It's probably going to be the first one that pops in. If you go to, not many people have my name. I don't know if anyone has my name, Tom Taulli. So if you go to LinkedIn, that's probably the best way. I can connect there, and you can message me there. For the books, just go to Amazon, put my name, and then that's easy. Yeah, but LinkedIn, I do pay attention to that.
We'll have those in the show notes, so don't worry about people remembering that piece. Thank you, Tom, for
Thank
coming
you.
on. It's a great conversation, as always, with you. And everybody, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow us on your favorite platforms. It helps us bring you great content. And check out what we do at civic.com and how you can connect your favorite AI agent securely to like your Gmail and your calendar without the fear of your precious stuff being deleted or modified without your consent. So see you next time on the podcast. Over and out.